The day my squad took on 40 Taliban and walked out alive did not start like a legend. It started like every other dusty, sleep-deprived morning in eastern Afghanistan, with sand in my teeth, sweat on my back, and the familiar weight of my rifle pressed against my shoulder. We were 10 men, a worn-out squad at the tail end of a long deployment, and if you had told me that by sunset we would be outnumbered 4-1 and fighting for our lives, I would have laughed it off as some Hollywood fantasy. My name is Sergeant Nathan Hale, United States Army. I have been in firefights before. I have heard rounds crack over my head, seen tracers stitch the sky, and felt the sickening silence after an explosion when your brain is still trying to understand whether you are alive or not. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that day in the valley when 40 Taliban fighters decided we were not getting out.
We were tasked with a simple mission. A presence patrol to check on a small village that had recently started cooperating with us. Simple in Afghanistan usually meant quiet until it's not. The village sat at the mouth of a narrow valley, surrounded by rocky hills that looked like they had been carved by some angry god. The route in was predictable, the kind insurgents love. Our platoon had been hammered by IEDs and ambushes before, so the plan was to move light and fast, stay off the obvious paths, and be back at the outpost before the heat turned unbearable. I led second squad, 10 men, each with their own cracks and scars, but by that point we moved like a single organism. Torres, our machine gunner, carried more ammo than common sense. Miller, my radio man, complained constantly but never once failed to get a call through. Lewis, the quiet kid from Ohio, still wrote letters home on paper, as if the internet did not exist. Each of them, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's whole world. To me, they were my responsibility. That weight never leaves your shoulders, no matter how many times you tighten your body armor. We stepped off just after dawn. The air was cool enough to trick us into thinking it would be a good day. The mountains, jagged and distant, stood like silent witnesses. We kept our spacing, every man scanning his sector, boots crunching on gravel, the clink of gear the only music. I could smell damp earth from an irrigation canal and smoke from cooking fires in the village ahead. It almost felt normal, like we were just walking through some rural town back home. Almost. The first sign that something was off was the silence in the village. Usually, kids would run out, women would pretend not to stare, and old men would nod grudgingly, judging us from doorways. That day, the streets were empty, doors shut, windows dark. There was a stillness to the place that scraped against my nerves. We moved in slowly, taking positions, scanning rooftops and alleyways. I lifted my hand, palm flat, and the squad stopped. "Anyone else feel that?" I whispered over the radio. "Yeah, Sarge," Torres muttered. "Feels like a horror movie." Miller tried to crack a joke, but his voice was tight. "Maybe they just don't like your face, man." I ignored them, my eyes tracing the ridgelines around the village. The valley narrowed beyond the last houses, cutting between two rocky hills cluttered with boulders and scrub. It was the perfect funnel. I made a mental note and sent 2 guys to check an abandoned compound while the rest of us secured a small open area near a well. That was when I saw him. An old man, standing alone at the edge of the village, staring at me. His face was lined like the hills, his beard gray and thin. Our interpreter wasn't with my squad that day, but I did not need him to understand the fear in the old man's eyes. He looked past me, toward the valley, then back at me. He shook his head slowly and raised one trembling hand, as if he wanted to say something and couldn't. Yeah, I thought, someone's waiting out there. We did a quick sweep, found nothing obvious, and I got the order from higher. Push deeper into the valley, get eyes on some compounds that had been flagged as potential weapon caches. On paper, it made sense. On the ground, every instinct in my body screamed that it was a bad idea. But war does not care about your instincts. Orders are orders. We moved out in a staggered column, hugging the broken walls and stone terraces that lined the valley floor. The sun was higher now, heat building in waves. Sweat slid down my neck under my helmet. I could feel the tension in my men, see it in the way their heads moved a little faster, their fingers rested a little closer to triggers. The valley grew tighter, the walls rising, closing us in. That is when the world exploded.
The first shots came from above and behind us, a classic L-shaped ambush. The crack of rifles echoed off the rock like thunder. Dirt kicked up around my boots. Somebody screamed, "Contact left! Contact rear!" Torres swung his machine gun toward the hillside, and the valley lit up with the staccato roar of 7.62 tearing into rock and dirt. "Get to cover!" I yelled, grabbing Miller by his vest and pulling him behind a low stone wall. Bullets shattered chunks of rock, showering us with dust and pebbles. I poked my head up just enough to get a glance at the slope. I saw muzzle flashes, dark figures moving between rocks, and suddenly it was obvious. There were a lot of them. "Rough count?" I shouted. "Too many," Torres grunted, squeezing the trigger in long, angry bursts. "I see like 20 on that ridge alone." He was wrong. There were more. The valley had become a killing ground. They had waited until we were deep enough that retreating would mean crossing open ground under fire. They had RPGs firing from the flanks, rounds smashing into walls, sending shards of stone flying like shrapnel. One rocket hit an abandoned building not far from us, and the blast shoved hot air against my face. "Miller, I need that radio." I crawled over to him, chunks of dirt hitting my helmet. "Get me higher." He fumbled with the handset, his hands shaking. "This is Red 2-6, troops in contact, multiple enemy positions, taking heavy fire, over." I heard static, then a calm voice. "Red 2-6, copy. Can you estimate enemy strength?" I looked at the hillside again. More figures, more flashes. They were coordinated, bounding between cover, trying to tighten the noose. "At least 3 squads," I said. 30 to 40 fighters. We are pinned in the valley. We need air and indirect yesterday." We were 10. They were about 40. Some part of my mind did the math, cold and detached. 4-to-1 odds, in open terrain, with the enemy in the high ground. Everything they teach you in infantry school tells you that you don't win that fight. You survive it, maybe. You endure it. You do not win. And yet, losing was not an option, because losing meant my men would not go home. "All right," I said, forcing steel into my voice. "Listen up. We hold here and we break their damn teeth. You see one of them move, you put him down. Short, controlled bursts. Watch your ammo. No one dies today unless it's them. You got me?" A chorus of "Roger, Sergeant," answered, some loud, some barely more than a growl, but it was enough. We established sectors of fire. Torres locked down the left, laying suppressive fire on the ridge where most of the enemy clustered. Lewis and Harper covered the right, watching for any attempt to flank us. I moved from man to man, checking magazines, adjusting positions, trying to keep everyone focused. The smell of gunpowder and dust thickened in the air, mixing with the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. I started calling out targets. "Red scarf, 2 o'clock, above that big rock. See him?" Lewis nodded, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The figure jerked and disappeared. "Good hit," I shouted. Little victories like that are fuel in a fight like this. They remind you that the enemy is not invincible. They bleed like you do. The Taliban were not stupid. They shifted their fire, probing for weak spots, trying to find an angle. An RPG slammed into the wall near Torres, showering him with debris. He went down, and for a second my stomach plunged. Then he rolled over, coughing, face bloody but eyes wild. I'm good," he yelled, dragging the machine gun back up onto the low wall. "You're gonna have to try harder than that, you sons of." The rest of his sentence was swallowed by gunfire, but hearing him curse felt like a blessing. Rounds kept snapping overhead.
Every time I raised my head, I could feel the air split above my helmet.
My world shrank to seconds between bursts, to counting the shots each man fired, to the constant awareness of where everyone was. Somewhere in that chaos, fear stopped being a sharp spike in my chest and settled into something colder, a companion I acknowledged but refused to obey. Miller finally got through with coordinates. Mortars from our outpost began to walk in along the ridgelines. The first few rounds hit long, sending plumes of smoke and dust into the sky. Then they adjusted, and the explosions began to chew into the hills where the fighters clustered. I heard shouts, saw figures stumbling, disappearing in the blasts. "Yeah," Harper yelled, "that's what I'm talking about." But the enemy did not break, not yet. They were determined, maybe desperate. Maybe they thought this was their chance to wipe out an American squad and become legends in their own circles. They pushed harder, sending fighters down the slopes in 2s and 3s, trying to close the distance and turn it into a close-quarters fight. Not on my watch. "Lewis, Harper, shift right, watch that gully, they're trying to sneak in," I called, firing short bursts to keep heads down. My rifle felt like an extension of my body, moving almost on its own. Sight picture, squeeze, recoil, next target. Time stopped being a line and turned into a series of flashes. A man in a black vest stumbling backward, a hand dropping an RPG, Miller reloading with shaking fingers, Torres screaming wordless rage as he raked the ridge again and again. At some point, I realized we were running low on ammo. It is a quiet kind of horror, feeling your last full magazines in your vest, knowing that every trigger squeeze is a trade between immediate survival and what might be coming next. I crawled over to Torres. "How many belts you got left?" He glanced down, his face smeared with dust and blood.
1.5, Sergeant. Make 'em count. Short bursts. We're not dying with empty pouches. Air support had been called, but in that valley, minutes felt like hours. The enemy knew they were on the clock. Their fire intensified, a frantic surge. Bullets peppered our cover. A round hit the stone inches from my hand, sending shards into my knuckles. I barely felt the pain. Then, for the first time, I thought we might not make it. It was a brief, brutal thought, a flicker in the back of my mind. I imagined my mother getting a folded flag. I imagined the faces of my men, younger than they had any right to be, lying still in the dust. The images made something harden inside me. "No," I whispered, "not today." "Red 2-6, this is Reaper." A voice crackled in my headset. "We have your position. Cleared hot along the ridge lines. Mark targets if you can." I wanted to hug the sky. "Miller, pop smoke on the left ridge," I shouted. "Purple, keep it away from us."
He nodded, pulled a grenade from his vest, and lobbed it with a shaky arm. A moment later, purple smoke billowed along the hillside, marking the enemy's main cluster. I gave corrections over the radio, heart pounding. The sound of the aircraft rolled over the valley like judgment. There is a particular roar that comes with close air support, a deep, guttural sound that you feel in your bones. Then the ridges erupted. Bombs tore into rock and dirt, sending clouds of dust skyward. The enemy's fire faltered, then fractured. But even with air on station, it was not over. The terrain, the cover, the scattered fighters, all of it meant they could still fight back. And they did. Desperation makes people stubborn. "All right, listen up," I shouted over the chaos. "We are not getting stuck here waiting for them to regroup. On my mark, we bound back toward the village, 2 at a time. Cover each other, keep your heads down, and if you stop moving, you better be dead." I split the squad into 2 teams. Team 1 would move while Team 2 covered. Then we would switch. It was basic infantry tactics, the stuff you learn in training, but using it under fire with 40 enemies still scattered around you is a different game. "Team 1, move," I yelled. Torres, Lewis, and Harper broke from cover, hunched low, boots pounding the dirt. Enemy fire sparked up immediately, rounds snapping past them, kicking up dust around their feet.
Team 2, me, Miller, and the others, opened up, throwing as much lead as we could to keep enemy heads down. My throat burned from shouting, my shoulder ached from recoil. "Set!" Torres yelled as they slid behind a half-collapsed wall farther back. "Team 2, move!" I shouted, and then I was running, every sense screaming. The world narrowed to the space in front of my boots, the tug of my gear, the whistle of rounds overhead. I could feel, more than see, dirt kicking up near my legs. I wanted to be smaller, flatter, anything to make less of a target. We dove behind the wall with Team 1, chests heaving. No time to rest. We repeated the dance, leapfrogging our way back toward the village. Every bound was a gamble. The enemy fired whenever they could. Sometimes the rounds came close enough that I could hear them buzz by my ear like angry insects. Twice, a man stumbled. Twice, someone else grabbed him, dragging him behind cover. By the time we neared the edge of the village, the air support and mortars had done their work. The ridges were scarred with fresh craters. Smoke drifted through the valley like ghosts. The enemy's fire had dropped off significantly. Instead of a coordinated barrage, it became sporadic, scattered shots from fighters who were either wounded, disoriented, or too stubborn to withdraw. We pushed into the village, using its walls and alleys as cover. From there, we set up a defensive perimeter, weapons trained on the valley mouth. My men were breathing hard, sweating, bleeding from minor cuts and scrapes. But they were all upright, all 10. For a few long minutes, we waited, rifles aimed, fingers hovering over triggers. Any moment, I expected to see fighters rushing out of the haze, trying one last push. Instead, the only movement was the shifting smoke and the distant echo of explosions finally fading. When the QRF arrived, it felt unreal. Other soldiers, fresh faces, more guns, more voices. They secured the area, checked the ridgelines, and confirmed what we already suspected. We had been hit by a large, organized force, close to 40 fighters, maybe more. Many of them would never fire another shot at anyone. We walked back to the outpost in a tired, stunned silence. My vest felt heavier than ever, not from gear, but from the knowledge of what almost happened. When we reached the gate, one of the guys in another squad clapped Torres on the shoulder.
"Heard you guys took on a whole damn army out there," he said. Torres smirked, wincing as the movement pulled at a cut on his cheek. "Nah, man," he said. "Just 40 Taliban. They should have brought more." There was laughter, the nervous, shaky kind that spills out after you look death in the eye and somehow walk away. But that night, when the lights went out and the laughter died, I sat on my bunk, staring at my hands. They were still trembling. People like to say we won that day, that 10 men took on 40 Taliban and came out victorious. On paper, that is true. We held our ground, inflicted heavy casualties, and all of my men came home from that valley alive. But victory in war is complicated. We won because my squad fought like hell, because the training we complained about back home became the thin line between life and death. We won because the outpost answered our call, because the pilots in the sky flew straight into danger for men they would never meet. We won because fate, or luck, or whatever you want to call it, tilted just enough in our favor. But I also know that for every story like ours, there is another squad that did everything right and still did not make it back. That knowledge sits heavy in my chest. It reminds me that what happened that day was not just courage. It was also a miracle. When I close my eyes, I can still see the valley, the way the sunlight hit the rocks, the way the dust rose after each explosion, the way my men moved, trusting me to lead them out. I remember the old man at the edge of the village, the warning in his eyes. I remember the taste of fear, the sound of bullets, the roar of jets. Most of all, I remember the moment, standing behind that cracked stone wall, when the odds were 4-1 and everything rational said we should not walk away. I remember how, in that moment, I chose not to listen to reason. I chose to believe in my squad. The world will never know all their names.
There will be no grand movie made about 10 exhausted soldiers fighting through a forgotten valley. But as long as I breathe, I will carry that day inside me. The day my squad took on 40 Taliban and won. Not because we were invincible, but because we refused to accept that we were already dead.